Have you ever been in a conversation online that just goes completely off the rails? It starts with a simple disagreement and somehow ends in a total meltdown, and you're left wondering, wait, how did we even get here? It really feels like our ability to just talk to each other is breaking down. Well, a new hypothesis suggests there's actually a hidden engine driving all this chaos. And today, we're going to pop the hood and see what's going on.
So let's dive into a puzzle that I think a lot of us feel in our gut. Our public conversations, especially online, just seem to be getting angrier, more intense, and way less productive. And the weird part is, this is happening even when the world itself isn't necessarily getting worse. So what is really going on?
I mean, this is the central paradox, right? We have more ways to communicate with more people than at any point in human history. So why does it feel like we're getting worse at it? Why does the temperature in the room just keep rising, even when the facts on the ground don't really seem to justify that level of intensity?
Now, we all know the usual suspects. People immediately point to things like misinformation, political polarization, the social media algorithms, or just plain old bad actors trying to stir up trouble. And look, those things are absolutely part of the problem. But the hypothesis we're exploring today argues they're just amplifiers. They're like gasoline being poured on a fire that was already burning for much deeper, more psychological reasons.
And this is where it gets really, really interesting. The Discourse Spiral Hypothesis suggests that there are 5 hidden psychological engines or spirals that are constantly running in the background of our minds and our groups. These aren't some external forces acting on us. Nope. These are deep-seated patterns of human thinking that, in our modern world, are just spinning out of control.
All right, spiral number 1 is called perceptual inertia. The best way to think about this is like an old smoke detector. It was installed to detect actual house burning down fires. But even after you've made the house way safer, it still goes off at the slightest hint of burnt toast or a little steam from the shower. Our brains, they do the exact same thing. They get used to a certain level of threat, and when that threat goes away, our minds don't just relax. They start looking for new, smaller things to label as dangerous. And this is not a left or right thing. It's a human thing. You see it everywhere. For instance, the legal frameworks that were designed to fight really overt legal discrimination back in the 1960s are still with us, but now they're often applied to much, much subtler dynamics in the modern workplace. On the other side, think about Cold War terms like Marxist. That word was once calibrated to a very specific, very real geopolitical threat. Now it gets used to describe domestic policies. It's like our old threat detection software is still running, it's just looking for new targets.
Okay, so that leads us to spiral number 2, critical escalation. We live in a world where the most valuable resource is attention, and that has created a kind of linguistic arms race. We just get used to outrage. So to get the same amount of attention today that you got yesterday, you have to turn the volume up to 11. A problem isn't catchy enough. It has to be a crisis. A simple disagreement becomes a vicious attack. The language just keeps inflating, and it gets more and more disconnected from what's actually happening.
And this isn't just a feeling we have. There's hard data on this. A 2017 study that looked at over 500,000 tweets found this incredible pattern. Just by adding words that trigger our moral emotions, words like evil, shame, or greed, a tweet became about 20% more likely to get shared. The system literally, algorithmically rewards escalation.
And this builds right into our third spiral, status competition. In stable, functioning groups, people usually gain status by helping solve problems. But in the fragmented, chaotic world of online discourse, conversations often aren't about finding the truth anymore. They're about performance. It stops being, hey, let's figure this out together, and it becomes, let me show my audience how smart and virtuous I am by absolutely dunking on you.
Now, this seems completely backwards, doesn't it? But a striking study from 2018 showed it pretty clearly. Researchers exposed people to opposing political views on Twitter, thinking maybe it would moderate their opinions. But the opposite happened. Users didn't change their minds. Instead, they doubled down, performing for their own in-group and using that opposing view as a prop to signal their own tribe's loyalty. What should have been a chance to learn became a stage for status competition.
Which leads us directly to the fourth spiral, purity policing. You might have heard the old saying, the heretic is more dangerous than the heathen. Why is that? Well, the heathen is an obvious outsider, but the heretic, that's someone inside your own group who isn't perfectly aligned. They threaten the very identity and clarity of the group itself. So it's often way safer and a better way to gain status to attack an impure ally than it is to take on a powerful external enemy.
And we see this play out constantly. Environmental movements can sometimes spend more energy fighting amongst themselves about the perfect tactics than they spend uniting against actual polluters.
And on the flip side, the term Reno, Republican in name only, is almost always aimed at another Republican, not at a Democrat. The energy turns inward, all to enforce an ever-narrowing, ever-purer definition of what it means to be a true believer.
And finally, the fifth spiral is something called concept creep. You can think of it as the paradox of progress. What happens is, as we get really good at reducing the most severe forms of a problem, let's say bullying, our definition of that problem doesn't just stay put, it expands, it creeps outward to include more and more subtle forms of harm. Now, this is often genuine moral progress, but it has this very strange psychological side effect. It can make it feel like nothing is ever getting better, because our moral goalposts are moving faster than we can solve the problems.
Bullying is the perfect case study for this. It used to mean something very specific, systematic, repeated domination. But over time, the definition crept. First, it expanded to include single instances of being rude. Then, it expanded again to include things like accidental social exclusion. And today, it can sometimes be used to describe almost any behavior that makes someone feel uncomfortable. Now, while those things can be hurtful, when you lump everything under the same scary label, it becomes really hard to tell what's severe and what's not. And it can make the problem seem bigger and more widespread than ever.
So, okay, we've got these 5 spirals: perceptual inertia, critical escalation, status competition, purity policing, and concept creep. But here is the absolute kicker. These are not 5 separate problems. They're all tangled together in one vicious, self-reinforcing system.
This is the most important takeaway. You can't just solve for one of them. Each spiral feeds on and amplifies the others, creating this powerful positive feedback loop that is incredibly difficult to interrupt.
So this diagram from the paper kind of shows how it all connects. Let's just trace one path. For instance, status competition, that need to perform and look good, drives purity policing because calling out an ally for being impure is a great way to signal your own virtue. And then that constant purity policing makes it really hard for the group to ever acknowledge progress, which in turn accelerates concept creep. It's like a self-fueling machine of outrage.
And a system like this has really bizarre consequences that explain why our discourse feels so broken and so strange. For example, if you try to fix one spiral, the energy just shifts over and makes another one worse. Or a conversation can seem totally stable, and then, bam, it hits a hidden tipping point and completely collapses into chaos. And weirdest of all, even if the thing that started the fight is gone, the system can get stuck in that high-intensity state, a phenomenon that scientists call hysteresis.
Understanding this system dynamic also helps us see why so many of our attempts to fix public discourse just seem to fall flat. We're almost always treating the symptoms, not the underlying system that's generating them.
Think about it. Fact-checking is crucial, but it's aimed at information. It doesn't do anything about the underlying drive for status competition. Content moderation might remove one inflammatory post, but it doesn't stop the linguistic arms race of critical escalation. And, as we saw in that study, just exposing people to opposing views can actually backfire when their real goal is performing for their team. Without seeing the whole system, we're basically just playing whack-a-mole.
So what does this all mean? Well, it means the goal probably isn't a cure. You can't just cure these spirals. They're baked into our psychology. The real, more realistic goal is to build dampeners, to find ways to slow the spirals down and prevent our conversations from grinding to a total halt. It's about preventing paralysis, not eliminating disagreement itself.
And that really brings us to the real challenge here. This whole hypothesis, it's not meant to be a reason for despair. It's a diagnostic tool. And as any doctor will tell you, you can't possibly fix a problem until you have correctly diagnosed what's wrong in the first place.
So why does this framework matter? Because it stops us from falling into the easy trap of just blaming bad people, and instead shows how even well-meaning, smart people can get caught in these incredibly dysfunctional patterns. It shifts our focus away from just yelling at each other and towards asking a much better, much more constructive question. How do we design communication systems that are actually resilient to these spirals? And that is the big thought I want to leave you with. This isn't just some abstract academic theory. It's a fundamental question about our collective future. We are trying to run a 21st century global society on minds that evolved for a profoundly different world. So, knowing our own cognitive bugs and biases, knowing these spirals exist, what kinds of conversations, what kinds of platforms, what kinds of institutions can we humans realistically sustain? That right there is the real challenge.